So I mentioned already that I had the chance to speak with my colleague friend who's in Australia this past week. We had the opportunity to speak because she actually had come to the US for a visit to see family and also to be a part of a retreat, an annual retreat that she and I and 30 of our close colleague friends participated in earlier in the week. For 2 days, we were in rural Virginia at a retreat center called Meadowkirk. And while we were there, I'll tell you a little bit more about what we talked about while we were there. But while we were there, I had one of my favorite scenes from film running through my head during the entire retreat. And so I'll tell you what the scene is and what the film is, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that it's a Woody Allen film, and I know that Woody Allen, there are allegations about Woody Allen that are less than becoming, so I'm acknowledging Woody Allen, asterisk, remembering the allegations against him, but nevertheless, it's one of my favorite films, and so I acknowledge his past while also honoring his art. The film is Annie Hall. One of the best Woody Allen films, one of the best movies of all time. And the scene that I'm thinking of is the scene where young Albie Singer, the Woody Allen character, as a child, goes with his mother to visit the pediatrician. And the mom says to the pediatrician that he's got a problem, and of course in the case of a young Woody Allen, it's an existential problem. The problem is that the universe is expanding. And that young Albie, knowing that the universe is expanding, he says to the doctor, he says, well, if the universe is expanding, then someday it's going to fall apart. And if it's going to fall apart, then what's the point of doing anything at all? And the mother yells back at him, she says, Brooklyn is not expanding, in Woody Allen's comic way. And then the mother adds to that, saying to the doctor about the Albie character, he stopped doing his homework. So this great scene juxtaposing the existential crisis of an expanding universe with the moral obligations that we as human beings have, knowing that on the one hand, we do have these moral obligations here on Earth, while also acknowledging that those moral obligations, when taken on a cosmic level, are kind of absurd. Someday our sun will implode. It will encompass with a fireball the entire first 3 planets of our solar system, and all of our efforts to do good and do right and do our homework will have been for naught. And what's more, it's not just our sun that's going to implode, but the universe is expanding, as young Albie Singer reminds us, leaving us both with a sense of awe and wonder at the enormity of everything that's out there, and also a feeling of infinitesimalness, if that's a word, of being here on Earth. So why was this movie and this scene in my head while we were on this retreat in rural Virginia? It's because it wasn't just a group of 30 rabbis getting together. We had with us a scholar in residence, and the scholar in residence was a professor of astrophysics, I guess actually of quantum physics specifically, named Pekka Sinervo. So Pekka Sinervo, here's a little bit of his biography. He's a world-renowned particle physicist. He is a leader in the CERN particle accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland, the biggest particle accelerator in the world. He was the leader of the research team that discovered the heavy quark, the largest subatomic particle that human beings know about. He led the research team that discovered the largest subatomic particle in the world. He does research on dark matter, and he was involved in the team of 3,000 scientists who collaborated to discover the Higgs boson particle, the so-called God particle. This is all sort of a resume way of saying a very impressive, world-renowned scientist came to spend 2 days with a group of rabbis. Because not only is Pekka Sinervo a world-renowned particle physicist, he also happens to be a past president of his synagogue in Canada, and also a past president of the Canadian version of the URJ, the Canadian network of Reformed synagogues and Reformed Jewish summer camps and Reformed day schools, all of which is to say, world-renowned physicist, deeply committed Jew. So he came and he spent 2 days with us talking about how the universe is expanding and how we as humans can grapple with that while also remembering that we have to do our homework. A very Jewish problem. A very Jewish problem. Here's how Pekka started the retreat. He brought out a cup of salt, and he passed it around the room. And he asked us all, and I'll come out to the congregation a little bit so you can see. He asked us all to try and estimate, just looking at this cup of salt, but without sort of reaching into it with our finger or with any kind of tool, to try and estimate how many individual grains of salt we thought there might be in this cup of salt. And we all were supposed to write down our answer on a little slip of paper, and I was hilariously so far off from the right answer. I wrote down a hilariously large number, and we all wrote down what we thought our number would be. He told us in the end, that of course using simple chemistry and simple physics and the kind of things that probably you could learn in a high school science class, that in this amount of salt, he told us what the weight of the salt was, in this amount of salt, we can pretty reliably say that there are some 1,500 grains of salt. 1,500 grains of salt in a cup of salt this large. And then he told us, why do you think I brought this amount of salt? And he told us the answer, because the number of molecules, not grains of sand, the number of molecules of salt in a cup like this, that number is the same number as there are stars in the universe. The number of molecules of salt in a cup this small is the same number as the number of stars that there are in the universe, in the known universe. That number is 200 billion trillion. 200 billion trillion. So a trillion, but then a billion trillions, but then 200 of those. 200 billion trillion molecules of salt in a cup this size. 200 billion trillion stars in the known universe. And then with the expert pedagogy, the expert teaching, the expert artistry that only a fabulous teacher can have, Pekka took this cup of salt, which represented the smallest things we know, molecules, and also the biggest thing that we know, the number of stars in the known universe. He took it, he placed it in the center of the circle, and he said, I'll just put the universe right there for now. That was just one example of the amazing experience that we shared together over the course of 2 days. At the end of the 2 days, in addition to all kinds of closing rituals and reflections and all the rest, we each had an opportunity to go around and say, like, the one word that encapsulated our experience. And for me, the one word came very easily. It's not really a word. It's the word wonderful. Wonderful. It was indeed wonderful to be together with these 30 beloved colleagues, including one who came all the way from Australia for our annual retreat, a most meaningful group to me, a most meaningful annual experience to get together and think and reflect and be in awe. But also to think about things as tiny as molecules, and to get to think about things as large as the universe, and to wonder, why should I do my homework if Brooklyn is expanding? Filled me with wonder. A wonderful experience. So I want to share with us tonight a little bit more about the experience. I keep in my office, framed on a shelf, a famous illustration. And at the end of our conversation, I'll pass it out. But here it is. It's an illustration by a early 20th century Jewish illustrator whose name is Ephraim Moses Lillian. Maybe some of us have seen the famous photograph of Theodor Herzl in Basel. Maybe you can picture Theodor Herzl. He's in Basel, the founder of the Zionist movement. He's in Basel at the first Zionist Congress. He's leaning over a railing like this. He's got his long black beard sticking down. The river, whatever the river is in Basel, is running alongside him. The famous photograph of Theodor Herzl, the person who took that photograph is the same person who drew this illustration. And I keep this illustration in a frame in my office. It depicts Abraham. The caption of the illustration is, Abraham contemplates the stars. Abraham contemplates the stars. Some of us might remember the verse from the book of Genesis where Abraham is feeling worried and concerned because he doesn't have any children. And after all, God has said that there's going to be kings that come forth from Abraham, but meanwhile, he doesn't have any children. And God says to Abraham, go outside and count the stars, if you can count them. So many shall your offspring be. And the illustrator Ephraim Moses Lillian depicts Abraham going outside and looking up at the stars and feeling wonderful. feeling a sense of wonder looking up. You'll notice that in this illustration, Abraham isn't just counting stars, isn't just trying to figure out if there's 200 billion trillion of them, isn't just trying to figure out how many offspring he shall have, but there's two other things going on. First, Abraham has a hand at his chest, taking it in awe, in wonder. And in the style that only an Art Nouveau European early 20th century artist could do it, in the stars, it isn't the normal constellations like the Big Dipper or Orion. In the stars is this beautiful Art Nouveau-like design where circles and squiggles, and someone who's better at art history will tell me how this is Art Nouveau, but it feels Art Nouveau to me, and I think it might to you as well. Look up and count the stars. How filled with awe are we when we do just what Abraham does in our Torah, not our Torah portion this week, in one of our Torah portions, and as Abraham does in this illustration here. So Pekka, our scholar in residence at this retreat, said something that I found really interesting. He said the following, I wrote it down carefully. He said, counterintuitively, the thing that matters most in science isn't certainty, but rather uncertainty. Counterintuitively, the thing that matters most in science isn't certainty, but rather is uncertainty. Think about Abraham for a minute here. Okay, if he knew how many stars there were in that sky, that'd be nice, certainty. But the thing that matters most is his uncertainty, his feeling of, oh my gosh, wow, what is that? How amazing is it? Pekka gave us a bunch of examples. Let's take our salt for a minute. I told you, and he told me, that there are 1,500 grains of salt in this cup, right? 1,500 grains. Well, is it exactly 1,500? No, of course not. It's not exactly 1,500. It's 1,500 give or take some amount. Is it give or take 10? Is it give or take 100? If it's give or take 10, then 1,500 is a pretty good estimate. If it's 1,500 give or take 100, then it's really not that helpful of an estimate. What matters is how certain we are, how small the margin of uncertainty is. Is the margin of uncertainty just 10? Or is the margin of uncertainty 100? The thing that really matters in making this calculation is not what we know, but how certain we are about what we know. How small or how wide the margin of uncertainty is. Another example that Pekka gave us, he said that the most important scientific experiments aren't the ones where our hypothesis going into it is proven. Rather, the most important scientific experiments are the ones where our hypothesis is disproven. A proven hypothesis just tells us that what we already thought is indeed the case. A disproven hypothesis tells us that whatever it is that we think isn't quite yet right. That there's still something more for us to discover, that there are still more questions we need to answer. We might know the shape of the question, even if we don't know the shape of the answer. That the thing that matters most in science isn't certainty, but uncertainty. A few more examples. He painted for us how it is that science fiction has helped to advance science. Think about Jules Verne. Jules Verne wrote From the Earth to the Moon in 1865. It wasn't until 100 years later that what he imagined in his mind became a reality with the Apollo 11 mission. Or think about another Jules Verne book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He wrote that in 1872. In 1872, submarines were very basic, non-highly functioning machines. The kinds of things that Jules Verne imagined would be in a submarine very closely and accurately predicted what future submarines would come to actually look like. One more example of how the thing that matters most in science isn't certainty, but rather is uncertainty. Dr. Cinervo's field is particle physics. And he talked about how there's this standard model of particle physics, which does a pretty good job of describing everything that happens in the universe. It describes all of the ways that matter works and all the ways that energy works, but it doesn't explain everything, and it doesn't explain everything perfectly. It doesn't explain things like dark matter and dark energy, and he explained it to us, but I couldn't follow it because it was very complicated. And he said that the things that we don't yet understand in the standard model, the things that we don't yet understand, are about the universe expanding. Our best model of things, our model where there's a nucleus with a proton and a neutron, and that's smaller than that, there are these quarks, which Pekka Cinervo helped to discover, might the model might describe all of those things, but it doesn't explain dark matter, and it doesn't explain dark energy. And the thing that tells us that those things might be out there is because we know that the universe is expanding and that the rate of expansion is getting faster. Not only is Brooklyn expanding and getting faster and faster in its expansion. All of these things, which are signs of uncertainty, what Pekka said is the most important thing in science, are exactly why Abraham is grabbing his chest. Because what we know is interesting, but what we don't know fills us with wonder and with awe. So I want to conclude by doing what this retreat was intended to do, which was to mix science and art, or more precisely, that's a word that's important in this talk, to mix science and religion. I have a poem that comes, well, I'll say about where it comes from, but I'd love to pass out a couple of copies of this so we can all kind of follow along. Poetry sometimes needs to be seen while it's read, otherwise it's too hard to follow. Maybe help these to just circulate in your section back here. Here's 2 copies for this section back here. So Ken or Robin will bring 2 more right over here. So on the front side of this page, you've got Abraham looking up in awe. And on the back, you have a poem, and I'll ask you not to start reading it just yet, a poem called Singularity. I first heard this poem on a podcast. There's a show called Radiolab. Some of us might be familiar with Radiolab. Radiolab did an episode called The Universe in Verse. The Universe in Verse, where they took the entire history of the universe and broke it down into, I guess, epochs. Is that how you say that word? Broke it down into epochs, and then found a poem that fit for each epoch. So a poem about the first monkeys that came down out of the trees and walked upright. A poem about the first fish that came up out of the water and suddenly became amphibious. A poem about the Big Bang. And this is the very first poem in the series, The Universe in Verse. It's a poem called Singularity. Singularity is the term that physicists use to describe when, before the Big Bang, everything that was in the universe was compressed into a tiny, tiny, tiny thing, like Pekka gave us a number, but I can't remember how tiny. The entire universe compressed into a single entity. This is the poem Singularity from before the Big Bang. It's written by Marie Howe, and the subtitle is After Stephen Hawking. So here we go, Singularity. Do you sometimes want to wake up to the singularity we once were? So compact, nobody needed a bed or food or money. Nobody hiding in the school bathroom or home alone, pulling open the drawer where the pills are kept. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Remember? There was no nature, no them, no tests to determine if the elephant grieves her calf or if the coral reef feels pain. Trashed oceans don't speak English or Farsi or French. Would that we could wake up to what we were when we were ocean, and before that, to when sky was earth, and animal was energy, and rock was liquid, and stars were space, and space was not at all. Nothing. Before we came to believe humans were so important, before this awful loneliness. Can molecules recall it? What once was? Before anything happened? No I, no we, no one, no was, no verb, no noun. Only a tiny, tiny dot brimming with is, all, everything, home. Shabbat Shalom.